So we wanted to start off our symposium this morning by talking about this new program that we launched this year on reportable animal zoonoses. And the reason is we think that this program, it does and will underpin a number of the zoonotic disease activities that occur in collaboration between public health, the public health sector and the animal health sector here in British Columbia. So the rationale behind this program is to increase all of our knowledge and awareness of zoonotic diseases in animals in order to prevent and to mitigate human illness in British Columbia. So this actually started, like a lot of programs in public health do, nearly 10 years ago now. In 2006, at the time, we had a different health act. It was the Health Act. We now have a Public Health Act. And in that act, it was mentioned that all people, including physicians, lab directors, and veterinarians, were to report any infection in people or animals or things to the medical health officer for their assessment and management. And so the BC Veterinary Medical Association, which is now the College of Vets of BC, contacted us, the BC CDC and the provincial health officer, to better understand this section in the law, because they were having requests or questions from veterinarians about what they should be reporting and to whom. And so a small working group was set up in 2007, and over the course of about 2 years, this group came together to determine which diseases were of interest to public health if they occurred in animals and had a potential for zoonotic transmission. And this working group was composed of public health practitioners and people from the Ministry of Agriculture, including the Chief Veterinary Officer at the time. And we used the similar methodology that the Public Health Agency of Canada uses to determine which diseases should be made notifiable at a national level. And these criteria were then adapted for zoonotic diseases. So by 2009, we had come up with a list of 14 diseases that were zoonotic, that if they occurred in animals, we wanted them to be reported to public health. And we presented this to the BC Communicable Disease Policy Advisory Committee, where they were approved. And since then, we've been working in a larger working group to develop the public health guidelines to help manage those diseases. That was the requirement that this advisory committee made, is fine, we are interested in these diseases because knowing about them will help us better respond to potential zoonotic threats to public health, but please tell us what we need to do when these occur. And so we set about developing these guidelines that I'll be presenting to you in a little bit more detail. And so in 2015, when these guidelines were finished, and at the same time the Animal Health Act was enacted, is when we launched this program. It was a soft launch, so many of you might not have heard much about it yet, which is why I'll be speaking about it this morning. So this is the list of 14 reportable zoonotic diseases in British Columbia. We have the very rare but severe anthrax, BSE, brucella. We have the more common chlamydiosis or psittacosis in humans, the influenzas, influenza A in swine, as well as influenza H7 and H5 and H7 in any animal species, plague, Q fever, rabies, trichinosis, tuberculosis, both Mycobacterium bovis and MTB, tularemia, West Nile virus, and zoonotic viral hemorrhagic fevers. Little did we know back then that we would actually get a large Ebola outbreak where this would actually be of potential concern. So this list you'll see is a mix of very serious, mostly serious diseases in humans, but mostly also very rare, except for rabies. We also felt it was important to capture anything else which we hadn't thought of or which could occur but rarely or unusually. And so there's a 15 category which is called new or unusual animal diseases or disease clusters with potential public health significance. And we define this as zoonotic or potentially zoonotic diseases occurring in animals that met one of these three criteria: have never or rarely been observed in British Columbia, appear in a new species or show evidence of higher pathogenicity than expected, and appear in a higher than expected number of animals clustered in time or space. So this is common in all lists of reportable diseases. You want to have a category that includes things that you might not have thought of or that could occur in an unusual way. So I've been speaking about these guidelines. These are publicly accessible guidelines. They are over 100 pages. Yes, thank you. There are over 100 pages of guideline, so I really thank the working group that spent the 4 years developing these, and they can be found online at the BC CDC website. You'll notice here that we have an introductory chapter which covers things like the reportability, the authority to report, the process of reporting, what variables should be reported, what timelines, and some basic principles that should be followed. And then we have a chapter for each of the 14 reportable diseases, and I'll give you, I'll talk a little bit more about that here. So each of the disease chapters is divided in the same way, in that it has an introductory section, which again talks about the importance of that disease and why that disease specifically is reportable, the authority to report it, and the very important epidemiology and epizoology of that disease, which provides the context for better understanding and responding to a case if it were to be reported. Then we have a section on the disease in animals. How does this disease present in animals? Incubation period, transmissibility, case definition. We have a section on the disease in humans. So how does this appear? How is the disease transmitted to humans? What is the case definition in humans? Is it treatable? Is it preventable? And the most important section is the public health response section. So what should public health authorities do if a case is reported to them? And it's divided into a risk assessment section. What questions should you ask? Who's responsible for asking those questions? Who do you interact with to get that information? A risk management section, which is what do you actually do with this? And for many diseases, it's nothing because someone else is dealing with this situation. And so, for example, BSE, most of the risk management is done by the CFIA. And public health has a minor role. The reason why that disease is reportable is to ensure that public health is aware of these cases, mainly to do risk communication activities. And however, that section will also include information on whether public health has to take any mitigation actions, such as chemoprophylaxis, vaccination, isolation, etc. And then finally, again, in the public health response section, there's a risk communication piece. What kinds of messages could you use to communicate either with exposed people or with the public if you needed to, as well as some references. I won't go into details because some of the case studies will describe some of this. So there are many principles that underpin the development of these guidelines, but I want to highlight two in particular. The main reason behind this program and how we wrote the guidelines is that we wanted to ensure and facilitate the collaboration in both the reporting and in the response to zoonotic diseases in animals. And so throughout the process, we encourage public health and vets, or the animal health sector, to discuss the situation. And that starts from the first point of reporting. So the way it has worked so far is usually Brian, as the public health vet in the Ministry of Agriculture, calls me at the BC CDC and we discuss the case. He reports it, he provides the context for that, any information he has about epizoology, about the zoonotic transmission potential, we discuss it, come up with some ideas of how to respond, and then I take that information and speak to the health authority where the animal case is occurring and transfer some of that information and some advice or some ideas as to how to respond, and then encourage the medical health officer or the environmental health officer in the health authority to pick up the phone and make the first phone call to the vet treating that case, that animal, because the vet will have a good idea about the case itself, who has already potentially been exposed in terms of human exposure, as well as any steps they've already taken to mitigate the situation. And so we encourage that communication throughout the reporting and responding phases. The other point we wanted to make is that if the health authority, the public health sector wanted to take actions that required communication beyond communicating with those people who were directly exposed, that be communicated back to all partners involved, but particularly to the Chief Veterinary Officer and her staff, so that they are aware, because the reporting goes through her, and I'll show you how that happens in a minute, so that they are aware and prepared to also be responsive if needed. And then the second major principle is respect for authority and the mandate of all the agencies involved. The major players in this program are the Ministry of Agriculture and the Public Health Sector, BCCDC and the health authorities. However, we recognize that the CFIA and the Ministry of Environment or the wildlife vet also play important roles, and we have outlined those roles throughout the documentation. And finally, a reminder, particularly to the public health sector, that the information that's being shared with them, both about the animal case, its location, so diagnostic information, is confidential under the Animal Health Act, and that farm information, so the location of the animal, is considered business information, and that's also considered private information under the BC Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. So the information is to be kept confidential, just as we would with human data. So the legal framework underpinning this is that we actually went with the Animal Health Act to support this program. So the reporting of animal cases of zoonotic diseases is governed by the regulation called Reportable and Notifiable Disease Regulation, which includes not just the zoonotic diseases, but all the diseases that the Ministry of Agriculture was interested in having reported to them under the new BC Animal Health Act. And then we developed an information sharing agreement whereby the reports that were made to the Chief Veterinary Officer could be shared with the public health sector, namely the Provincial Health Officer, but delegated to the BC CDC under the information sharing agreement for the sharing of zoonotic communicable disease reports from the CVO to the PHO or delegate. So this is how it would work in practice. Under the Animal Health Act, veterinarians, labs, inspectors, and owners of animals are all to report the reportable diseases to the Chief Veterinary Officer, who under this information sharing agreement would share that information with the BC CDC, who would then share it on with the Medical Health Officer. What we're suggesting is that then the first step the Medical Health Officer or their staff would take is to discuss the case with the vet, conduct their risk assessment, and communicate that back to the BC CDC and the Chief Veterinary Officer so that everyone is aware of what is going on. We're suggesting that the timelines for reporting be immediate, meaning everybody who gets the information on cases of rabies, influenza, and viral hemorrhagic fevers reported immediately to the next person in line, so the Chief Vet Officer to the BC CDC, etc., and within 24 hours for all of the other zoonotic diseases. We have also recommended that the following small set of variables be reported at the same time as the actual case is reported. So the etiology or diagnosis, the animal species affected, the location of the animal, as well as the contact information of the owner. And we've also traditionally also shared the contact information of the vet. So just to give you a snapshot, when we prepared for this program, we knew we wouldn't have a lot of cases, and this was one of the selling features of the program. Nobody wanted to embark on this if we would be overwhelmed with work and response. And this is about the number we had expected. So we had 3 cases of rare zoonotic diseases reported. We had a Q fever case in a cow in Fraser Health in January, blastomycosis in a panda, again in Fraser Health in August, and psittacosis in birds in Fraser Health in September. We also had, as expected, about 10 cases of rabies in bats, and we knew this would be the most active file. It has always been. And we have a relatively separate process that has been going on for a while to respond to rabies. But this was to introduce you to this program. These cases will be presented to you in the rest of the symposium, including the blasto in the panda, the psittacosis in the birds, and an overview, as well as a case of rabies so that you can get a better sense of how these guidelines and how the program is working. And finally, I'd like to make this comment in that the whole program was built around the reporting of animal cases of zoonotic disease to public health to increase our early warning and awareness and response to these situations. However, the working group, as well as the committees involved in approving this program, have all felt strongly that the sharing of information about human zoonotic diseases by public health authorities with animal health authorities can also improve our understanding and control of these diseases in animals and should be endeavored. So although that aspect is not under legislation and there is no program, we do attempt to share information on cases of human illness associated with zoonoses with our animal health colleagues so that we have a better overall understanding of the burden of disease and the risks in our province. So thank you to all the people who've been involved over the last 9 or so years in the development of this program. And I hope that in a few years we'll be able to present some more fulsome data as well as an evaluation of how this program has been working. Thank you.